From Public Radio International, this is a special edition of The World, a co-production of the BBC World Service, PRI, and WGBH Boston, with funding provided by Merck, pharmaceutical research dedicated to preventing disease and improving health. Merck, committed to bringing out the best in medicine. And by the Medtronic Foundation. When life depends on medical technology, Medtronic provides millions of patients and their physicians with therapies designed to restore health, extend life, and alleviate pain.
Hello, I'm Tony Kahn with a special edition of The World. You may not remember what happened on Tuesday, May 19th, 1998, but we do. Miles above the Earth that day, the Galaxy 4 communications satellite wobbled slightly in orbit, shutting down the beepers, pagers, ATM machines, and radio and television feeds of over 50 million people, and nearly knocking us off the air. Without warning, we'd almost become one of our leading news stories. What made the development even more surprising was the scale. The Galaxy 4 wasn't much larger than a fishbowl. A spin that would barely have made a fishbowl ripple had blacked out a major slice of the developed world. No other story we'd covered, it seemed to me, showed better how nowadays a little can go a long way.
At last, the American government is aware that it must take a leading part in organizing the military forces of the free world.
It's no news that the world has developed an erratic spin of its own since the end of the Cold War. Back then, the political geography was elementary. One major ideological battle, two superpowers, and three worlds, capitalist, communist, and unaligned. Today, predicting the next hotspot seems less a job for an historian than a weather forecaster. Seemingly small local disturbances can skip frontiers and swell into global disasters overnight. During the Cold War, the timescale was positively leisurely. Major developments evolved slowly, which is why they were called developments, and journalists had breathing room to consider what was happening and why. Today, with communications technologies beaming information and misinformation across the globe at light speed, our image of the world is not unlike something you could have seen from the Galaxy 4 even after it broke down, a planet of borderless land masses, half in the dark and very much at sea.
Time marches on.
With all that uncertainty, how does an international news hour like The World determine which of the day's events are likely to mean the most? Well, you head straight to the scene of the action, of course, and you question the experts and the authorities. But just as important, you try to take some time and some side trips behind the statistics and the official understandings, to the streets, the homes, and the lives of ordinary people after the media go home. In the next hour, I hope you'll join me on some of the trips we've taken recently in Tony Kahn's journal, for some encounters with people behind the headlines and a more personal look at the news. Since the end of the Cold War, no statistic has been more chilling than the number of people slaughtered by their neighbors. Genocide is a partisan term, but whatever you call it, in Rwanda, Bosnia, Kosovo, East Timor, the process has been the same. Men, women, and children rising up in murderous fear and rage against men, women, and children they've known all their lives. In search of the reason why, in July of 1998, I visited with a reporter who survived a genocide greater than any since the end of World War II, the decimation of as much as a third of Cambodia's people by their fellow countrymen, colleagues, and sometimes family and friends.
All right, this is it! Is the floor clear? This is the last check!
In April 1975, as American diplomats fled Phnom Penh, the Khmer Rouge, a communist guerrilla movement led by Pol Pot, consolidated its hold on Cambodia.
I'm leaving!
The 1984 film, The Killing Fields, told the story of two men in Phnom Penh that day, Dith Pran, a Cambodian interpreter, and his friend and colleague, New York Times reporter, Sidney Schanberg.
The vast majority of people who were the targets of the Khmer Rouge, the people in the cities, deeply believed there would be a reconciliation. But no one had a clue that there was going to be a kind of genocide.
One of the first prisoners the Khmer Rouge took was Sidney Schanberg. He was arrested with other journalists and driven in an armored personnel carrier to the edge of town.
We could see the river, and there were men outside with their automatic weapons on their hips pointing at the door. And we just assumed that they were going to shoot us and roll us down the riverbank into the river. We were nothing to them.
The illiteracy of the troops saved Schanberg's life. Dith Pran told them that Schanberg and the others were French journalists covering the Khmer Rouge victory. The soldiers couldn't read Schanberg's passport and know the claim was a lie.
We were saved. However, there were these two officers in the Cambodian Navy who had been picked up on the street. And they'd been praying the whole time. That's when you feel responsible, because you're free and they're going to be dead.
The targets of the Khmer Rouge were the educated, the business people, the intellectuals, the teachers, anyone with an eye on Cambodia and its future in the world. Less than 4 years later, 2 million of them, a third of the nation, lay dead and decomposing in killing fields. Yet, aside from the film, few images of it ever reached the West or survive to haunt our collective memory. Today in Cambodia, Schanberg says, the killing fields still exist, inside each Cambodian.
Someone will be riding a bicycle down a main boulevard, and suddenly the bicycle will veer out of control and hit the curb or hit a parked car. The person will fall off. What happened? What happened was that an image thrust itself back into their head. A father, mother, relative, living under the Khmer Rouge, dying on the mud floor of a thatch hut, starving to death, asking for food, and there's no food to bring them. And so you watch the loved one die. That image is seared into their head. And as much as they try to get back to, quote, normal life, it will never go away completely. And they just break down and fall off the bicycle.
The murder of 2 million people takes a population numbed to killing by years of war, immobilized by the fear of speaking out, and ripe for manipulation by generations of suffering and rage.
There is rage in pockets everywhere in the world, people who feel left out and exploited. Someone comes along and says, I can end the exploitation by the capitalists, the Jews, whoever's going to be the scapegoat. And this person has a charisma, and they rally around. And sometimes the rest of the world doesn't do very much about it.
What the victims of the Khmer Rouge suffered from most, says Schanberg, was the feeling that nobody knew what was going on. He recalls the story of one group of prisoners whom a friendly Khmer Rouge guard let listen to his radio.
These men gathered around this radio, huddled, and they had it muffled with a piece of cloth. And they heard on the BBC World News that a plane had dropped bombs on Khmer Rouge positions. So they knew that somebody in the outside world knew what was going on and had bombed the Khmer Rouge. And one of the men said, now I can die in peace. The next morning, they were marshaled out into the yard, and he walked forward and struck a Khmer Rouge guard, and he was instantly shot to death.
For a world growing smaller by the second, says Schanberg, the lesson of Cambodia is twofold. We need to respond to problems more quickly, but we also need to appreciate that the real solutions take time.
This is a country that had an election under UN auspices in 1993. But you don't plant democracy with one election. And we're not patient. We want to have an election and say, okay, well, we've taken care of that genocide. Now we'll move on to the next one. It's not that way. And we do have an obligation. I mean, it's one thing you do learn when you live in a foreign country and bad things happen and you feel a level of responsibility. You learn that you are your brother's keeper. It doesn't matter whether you want to be or not. You are.
One minute you might be 100 yards away from where the trouble seems to be, and then all of a sudden you're in the front lines and people next to you are getting shot.
Author Bob Shikochis might have been describing another Cambodia here, suffering from the indifference of the United States. Sadly, it was the opposite. He was talking about an American mission in Haiti to restore President Jean-Bertrand Aristide to power in 1994, 3 years after a military junta had thrown President Aristide out. By then, Haitian society had collapsed into vengeful mobs supporting Aristide, terrified and trigger-happy state police supporting the Cedras regime, local mobsters and drug dealers settling personal scores, and a crushing poverty hard for most of us to understand. At one point, Shikochis jumped into an alley to save his life and discovered that the terrified Haitian on top of him was holding on with one hand and picking his pocket with the other.
The terrible absurdity of it was shoved in my face when I turned around and there was a man being beaten to death right in front of me, so close that the blood was splashing over me and everybody else.
Operation Restore Democracy, as it was called, was one of over 20 missions America's Green Berets and Special Forces have undertaken since the end of the Cold War. Its murky course underscored the central dilemma of American foreign policy since the fall of the Soviet Union. With no significant enemies or allies forcing us to defend the principles of freedom and democracy abroad, well, why bother? In the era of Galaxy 4, where a major threat to national security can roar out of nowhere fast, why risk power, prestige, or personnel where they're not strictly needed? Bob Shikochis published an account of the Haiti expedition called The Immaculate Invasion and spoke with me about it in May of 1999.
The motto of the Special Forces is De Oppresso Liber, to free the oppressed. In Haiti, they thought they finally had the chance to live up to their motto. Those soldiers, in fact, their job the next morning was to help build a school down the street near the Ministry of Justice. But the Cedras regime staged this demonstration.
As the troopship pulled into the capital of Port-au-Prince, the head of the junta organized a demonstration on the docks, threatening the Green Berets with something more frightening than the Haitian army, a repeat of the nightmare called Somalia. 8 days earlier, an American operation to restore order in the starving African nation of Somalia had stumbled into a firefight with a local warlord. Surrounded by ragtag guerrillas and armed children, 18 U.S. Army Rangers and Delta Force operators had been slaughtered and dragged through the streets.
Americans were appalled to the core. This was supposed to be a humanitarian mission. How come we have dead soldiers being dragged around through this third world dump somewhere that they couldn't even find it on the map?
Eventually, more than 20,000 American soldiers served in Haiti, but the shadow of Somalia dogged every step they took. Establish order, they were told, but don't take sides. Act like a soldier, but don't put your life on the line. On one occasion, says Shikochis, an American intelligence officer was court-martialed for trying to stop human rights violations in the federal prison of Port-au-Prince.
He was told not to worry about it, that American soldiers weren't here to stop Haitian-on-Haitian violence. They were here simply to provide a stable and secure environment. He went to the chaplain, and the chaplain said, look, I don't want to get involved in anything political. He went to the Inspector General of the 10th Mountain Division, and the Inspector General said, if you do anything else, it's going to be over the line. Well, he showed up at the prison, and the warden got one of his buddies at the American Embassy to come get him out of there, take him back to his unit at the 10th Mountain, where he was put under psychiatric evaluation, eventually shipped back to the States and court-martialed.
2 months after Operation Restore Democracy began, the start of the O.J. Simpson trial swept the American press off Haiti like a hurricane. When American forces handed off the operation to the United Nations on March 31st, 1995, and went home, there was hardly anyone there to tell the story. The Haitians had little to celebrate. Per capita income had plunged. Crime had skyrocketed, and the island's credit rating had sunk from worst in the hemisphere to virtually worst in the world.
Of the Green Beret, silver wings upon their chest, these America's best. 100 men will test today, but only 3 win the Green Beret.
Author Bob Shikochis says the Haitian people were suffering with hope.
And the fact is, after you're saved by America, quote unquote saved, who's going to save you now? There's no other train coming into this station.
The Green Berets had little to feel good about themselves. Every mission they've undertaken, from Nicaragua to Guatemala and Somalia to northern Iraq, has left them feeling militarily frustrated or morally compromised. There's not much to feel proud about between a mission in Vietnam they booed you for when you got home and a mission in Haiti they barely even knew you went on.
Ultimately, most of the things we've been involved in have turned out not to matter to us. You know, I have to be openly cunning about the promotion of the book. The word Haiti doesn't appear anywhere on the cover of the book. Would probably have been a bad marketing choice to do that. Even the rhetoric of the book, the first line of it is, "This is a book about America."
In the absence of long-term friends, long-term commitments, and long-term enemies, what do we stand for? And for how long? Do we, and can we, protect our democracy and ideals by keeping them for domestic consumption only? And how strong can those values be if they're not put to the test of life and limb?
Gary Metalus was my interpreter and friend, and every time I would return from being back in the States, I'd say, "Gary, how are things going?" And one time he said, "Well, Bob, the people are suffering with hope." There's a Creole proverb that translates into something like, "Misery can't kill Haitians."
But hope can.
I think hope is much more devastating for the Haitian than misery, because it has always disappointed them, always broken their hearts. And where do they turn to now?
Coming up, a woman learns the meaning of words she sung all her life. We visit with Mary Moran when we return with this special edition of The World.
The World is brought to you by PRI with the support of Merck, dedicated to the needs of society through pharmaceutical research and consumer education to improve the quality of life. Merck, committed to bringing out the best in medicine. And by the Medtronic Foundation. When life depends on medical technology, Medtronic provides millions of patients and their physicians with therapies designed to restore health, extend life, and alleviate pain.
Hello, I'm Tony Kahn with a special edition of The World.
Well, my mother told me that it was an African song, but she didn't knew what it was herself, and she taught it to me. And
Not long ago, a 75-year-old woman from Georgia named Mary Moran told me about a song she'd learned at her mother's knee.
She said her grandmother taught her this little African song. That's what she told me.
Nobody knew what the words meant. The song had come from her great-grandmother, a slave from Sierra Leone, and had lost its meaning long ago. An anthropologist had a recording of Mary's mother singing that song in the 1930s, and he took it with him on his travels, hoping someday to find someone who could identify it. 7 years ago, in a small village in Sierra Leone, he succeeded. So when they found somebody who recognized this song, this was an old lady who recognized the song, and she had learned it, I guess, from her mother or grandmother. What did you find out that song was about?
They buried the dead by that song. That was a funeral hymn.
Did you meet the woman who recognized that song and who had learned it
Oh,
herself
yes.
from her
Oh,
ancestors?
yes. I was with the Lady Wednesday.
The old lady was the only one left in her village to know the song. Soon after, the anthropologist learned about Mary and arranged for the two women to meet in Sierra Leone.
Oh, it was a beautiful meeting. We was happy, we cried, and we got happy again. Because she believed she found a sister, some of her family from across the ocean.
Could you sing a little of that song for us?
Okay. I walk among a crumbly alley, lily, Kwambe, I walk among a
Mary's version of the song and that of the old woman in Sierra Leone were identical. Through 200 years and all the disasters of distance, not a word had changed.
Has a willy go see how your bunga lily, has a willy go dwell in the queen.
Most of the songs we sing together these days are far more improvised. As the world's borders become more porous, we often find that to keep making music together, we have to adjust constantly to new harmonies and new major and minor chords.
This is a little painting.
In a recent Tony Kahn's journal, I visited with an American-born woman named Lynn Visson and her Russian-born husband, Boris. Author of a new book called Wedded Strangers, Lynn talked about the strains and the satisfactions, the breakdowns and the breakthroughs of Russian-American couples, one of the most explosive cultural combinations since the end of the Cold War.
What's amazing is that even in years when it was extremely difficult, there were an enormous number of these marriages taking place.
Nowadays, with a booming post-perestroika trade in matchmaking, the main problem facing Russian-American couples isn't getting together, it's staying together. Take this rough start between a Russian woman and an American man who were introduced over the internet.
The woman, as soon as she moved into the man's apartment, sewed all his sheets together to form the kind of little packet into which a Russian puts a blanket. He was not terribly amused. In another case, a Russian woman, whenever the man went out to the store, would criticize whatever he had bought, because her idea was a man couldn't possibly know how to buy food. Obviously, any salesperson would cheat him, and he was probably getting the worst things in the store.
Lynn says the differences crop up in every aspect of married life. Take sex.
One Russian man said to me that his wife treated sex like a woodworking class, and that she was telling him every minute what to do, when to breathe, how to do it, and when to stop. Russians feel that people do have a certain right to their own mystery, and that there is no point in analyzing all of this to death, that it's the best way to kill a relationship.
Take money. Most everyday American financial transactions are, for Russians, voodoo economics.
Many Russians still find it basically a somewhat mystical concept. Why, if I write you a check, by some very weird process, that check eventually finds its way home to me.
The same is true for savings and financial planning of any kind.
I know at least one couple where when the American wife suggested the Russian husband buy life insurance, he was horrified. He said, "What's the matter? You want me dead?"
Then, of course, there's that minefield of married life, just spending time with a friend of your own.
The man said that he was going to go out with a friend for a drink at 8 o'clock. When he wasn't back by 4 o'clock in the morning, the wife was calling up all her friends to see where he was, and when he came in at 5:45, he was perfectly nonchalant. What am I, a small boy? I have to call mommy every 2 minutes? A Russian feels that a friend is someone to whom you can say anything, whom you can call and who'll come over at 3 in the morning. You may have few friends, but they are real friends. While an American may say, "Oh, I have 50 friends," but none of them will be up to snuff in terms of the Russian definition.
There's a specter haunting the Russian-American marriage, the ghost of the Russian past. Survival in Russia demanded qualities of Russians that many Americans find dogmatic, sneaky, self-defeating. Lynn says this Russian obstreperousness shows up in every aspect of the marriage, from the rearing of children to the meaning of honesty.
In Soviet Russia, what was a Russian to do if there was a party meeting coming up and his best friend was supposed to be given a reprimand or be censured at that meeting? To go and vote to censure your friend is not very nice. To vote against it, you were subjecting yourself to a possible loss of job and all kinds of penalties. What was the best thing to do? Call in sick. Bosses lied to subordinates, subordinates lied to the people under them, husbands lied to wives, wives lied to husbands, parents lied to children. One Russian said to me, about his American wife, "My wife is incapable of lying, and it makes her very difficult to live with."
10 years of perestroika have done nothing to change a national character baked deep into Russian bones. And the cultural and historic weight of Russia, in all its contradictions, from the Russia of stupendous brutality to the Russia of some of the greatest writers who ever lived, is a burden every Russian carries in his soul. Given all that, it's a miracle a Russian knows what it means to say "I am" to his own identity, much less "I do" to a Russian-American marriage. And yet, these marriages survive, sometimes even thrive. Before I left their Manhattan apartment, I asked Boris and Lynn one last question. If there is one quality in the other to which you attribute the longevity of your marriage, what would it be? Boris offered an answer, очень глубокая дружба, a very deep friendship.
In our case, as in any really true marriage, the spouse is your number one friend, for whom you have the kind of feelings you don't have for anybody else in the world.
As many couples would testify, what ties you together isn't seeing eye to eye, but deep into each other's hearts, strengths, and weaknesses. Russians are drawn to our freedoms and yet feel we're superficial. We're drawn to Russia's passions, yet feel they're dogmatic. Clearly, there's a lot to learn from each other. Or, as a Russian might put it, since we're going to fight anyway, why not fight about something really important?
Пикей, ну так я не могу. Это же все слышно, что у него включен. Только не шуми, потому что ужасно слышно.
Coming up, an American woman barely out of her teens changes the course of Japanese history.
It was just a fluke. I was at the right place at the right time. And one day, General Whitney...
We meet Beate Gordon next on this special edition of The World. Hello, I'm Tony Kahn with a special edition of The World.
We are, all of us, part of one indivisible and common humanity.
There are few voices left in the world today like Nelson Mandela's. If great leaders rise to meet great challenges, there may be no bigger indictment of the uncertainty of our era than that growing silence. There's no shortage, of course, of remarkable people who inspire their colleagues and countrymen, revolutionize their fields, even change the thinking of a nation. Over the years, I've had the privilege of speaking with a number of them. They're scientists, artists, teachers, parents, concerned citizens, but in my experience, no politicians. Maybe there's a conflict inherent in holding political power while holding on to your personal vision. Still, these private citizens remind us of what a person can do when unclouded by compromise and focused on more than short-term goals. One of them was Aaron Lansky, a young man I profiled in a Tony Kahn journal of May 1998, whose love of Yiddish books helped rescue an entire culture.
Look at all the boxes piled up, everything from jet-puffed marshmallows to liquor to Office Depot, and all of them filled with Yiddish books from everywhere, from South Africa and from Argentina.
1,000 books arrive at the National Yiddish Book Center every week from basements, attics, and dumpsters around the world.
This was something called the Allgemeine Encyclopedia, begun in Paris in 1937. This book was published in, you can see, on 175 East Broadway in New York in 1918.
Spend a little time with Aaron Lansky, the center's director, and you get the feeling he loves each volume equally, not just for its deathless prose, but for its individual powers of survival.
You want to tell you a great story? One night I find a pile of books, and among them I find this one very thick volume, about 1,000 pages. And it was a dictionary of foreign and political terminology in Yiddish, published in Kiev in 1929. Well, that's a very important book because it tells you how Jews are viewing the world at that time. It's really significant. And after several hours, I find it written. The NKVD, the predecessor of the KGB, confiscated all copies at the publishing house and none survived. And here I am holding this book in my hand. I start trembling. My heart's thump, thump, thump. I don't know what to do first. I thought maybe I should run downstairs and turn on the burglar alarm. Well, what a find this was. Sure enough, a woman called up. Her father had been a cousin of the author of this book. He traveled to visit his cousin, and he was there as these books were coming off the line, and the cousin said, "Here, take one home with you." Just hours later, the NKVD came in and confiscated all the remaining copies and burned everything.
Hurry up, ain't a life in business, ain't a life in shop.
You don't have to go to Russia to save a Yiddish book. There are plenty of them in trouble around the corner. Once, Aaron got a call in the middle of the night. A dumpster on 16th Street in New York City was hemorrhaging Yiddish books. They had been in the library of a Jewish organization that had gone bankrupt and sold its building for co-op apartments. The workers had already hauled 7,000 volumes to the trash. If the books hadn't started spilling into the street, no one would have ever known.
Sure enough, this dumpster was just overflowing with really priceless Yiddish books of all sorts. And we spent the rest of that day in pouring rain and sleet hauling these books out of the dumpster. By the end of that day, we had saved about 5,000 books, and I'm afraid about 3,000 were damaged beyond repair.
Lansky has the energy of a man racing against time. Like most American Jews of his generation, he grew up in a home where Yiddish was something you kept from the children. When he was old enough to study it in school in Canada, it was almost too late.
We couldn't find the books we needed for our classes. Grandparents would die. They would leave amazing libraries behind. But the kids couldn't read the books, or the grandchildren certainly couldn't read them. They really didn't have a clue what they were. Books were literally ending up in the trash. So I decided to take a 2-year leave of absence to rescue the world's Yiddish books while there was still time. It's now 18 years later. We've collected about 1.4 million volumes and are still going strong, and I'm still on leave from graduate school.
So am I. If graduate school had been like this place, I never would have left. Set on 10 acres of an old apple orchard in western Massachusetts, the center looks like a cluster of Jewish dwellings from Minsk. Shtetl rooftops rise and merge into a single skylight, spilling sunshine on the books and the people who come from around the world to see them, and the exhibits on Yiddish history and culture. But the center is also a cemetery. Yiddish thrived for 1,000 years and then was nearly wiped out in 20. These books aren't just treasure chests of a culture, they're its tombstones. Over half of the native speakers of Yiddish fell to the Nazis in World War II, and Stalin picked up where Hitler left off. Not long ago, when the Soviet Union was breaking up, Aaron went to Eastern Europe to bring some of his books back home, to the children and the grandchildren of the book's earliest readers. It wasn't much of a reunion.
I remember at one point we were in a little community, and I'm looking around and I said, my God, it looks just like a shtetl here. I mean, there are still thatched roof houses, goats tethered in the yards, and there were women washing clothes down by the river. I mean, like nothing had changed. And we were with two kind of tough guys from Vilna they had sent up. He says, it was a shtetl. He said, this was Vilcomir, a very well-known Jewish city, a Jewish town before the war. Well, all the Jews, all 10,000 Jews of Vilcomir were murdered by the Nazis, all in one day, actually. They were brought to the edge of the town and murdered. And at the edge of the town, we find the old Jewish cemetery, except it was just a big open field with a kid's ball field at one end of it. And in the whole field, there was one Jewish gravestone left. And even that had been put up by Jews from Vilna just a few months before. And they said, do you want to know where those mitzvahs, where those Jewish tombstones went? We said, yeah. And they took us to a large government building called the Palace of Trade Unions. There's a huge, grand, kind of ceremonial staircase going up to this building. And as we look closely at the rocks, the stones making the staircase, we realized it was built out of Jewish tombstones. You could still see the Hebrew writing on them. I have to tell you, out of 6 weeks of grueling travel in the Soviet Union, that was the most devastating moment.
I thought to myself, it's like this. A tree grows in the forest, a mighty oak with outspread branches, and an ignorant lout comes along with an axe and chops off a branch, and then another and another. What is a tree without branches, alas? Go ahead, lout, chop down the whole tree, and let there be an end. What good is a naked oak in the forest?
Here was a whole civilization, 1,000 years of Jewish life in Europe. Jews living on the outside like that developed a profound sense of social justice, a commitment to human decency, to peace. Unless you had a decent world, Jews were going to be the first to get it, and they knew that. And therefore, the language just insists upon a kind of decency in everyday life. And of course, the literature is full of it.
Look at me. I wanted to be clever and tried everything I knew. And then when I saw it was no use, I took my hand off my chest and said to myself, Tevye, you're a fool. There is no wound so deep that it does not heal in time. There is no sorrow so great that you do not forget it eventually. That is, you do not forget, but what can you do about it? Man must work, man must till the earth in the sweat of his brow. And so we all went to work. My wife and children got busy with the pitchers of milk, and I took to my horse and wagon, and the world continued in its course.
The great literatures in world history are the literatures of outsiders' sensibility of all sorts. I mean, if you're comfortable, you don't have to write literature. You don't need to write novels. You can sit at home and have nothing to worry about. It's those who are on the outside in all sorts of ways who begin to write our great literature for us.
It's hard to share Lansky's faith in the future. Throughout history, cultural extinction has been the rule. For every book here, there are probably 1,000 from long-dead cultures that were never found. Besides, things are okay now in America. Why be reminded of all the times and the places when things weren't?
We can belong now. I mean, America said welcome aboard, and there's no reason for us to stay separate. Is the day of Yiddish over, however? As a culture? Definitely not. How in the world can you take a millennium of Jewish experience, throw it out the door, and still expect to know who you are? How can you take one of the most extraordinary literatures, throw it away, and expect to have some sense of continuity?
Lansky got a MacArthur Foundation so-called Genius Fellowship in 1989 for his 18 years of work saving Yiddish books. And maybe he knows something we don't. Like they say, a wise man hears one word and understands two. One thing you've got to say for him, he does have good timing. If he'd started 10 years earlier with this project, there'd have been no support. If he'd started 10 years later, there'd have been no books. And without good timing, you can't have an ear for the music.
Think about if you had a great musical composer, right, who's walking down the street, suddenly is mugged and stabbed and the guy's killed. Well, how would you commemorate that composer? Would you keep building more and more and more statues of the mugging? Or at some point, would you begin playing the music? What we're doing here is trying to play the music already. Yes, we must mourn. Yes, there are times for that. But there are also times to contend with the culture in a real way. These were real people living real lives. They weren't all that different from us. And they created something amazing. And it's up to us to figure out what that was and figure out what we can do with it to then strengthen our own lives.
I'm Tony Kahn with a special edition of The World. In 1997, I received a call from Beate Gordon, a woman active in American and Japanese cultural exchange. I'd met her when I was 16, and I remembered her as a woman of great kindness who knew how to listen patiently, even to an adolescent with nothing much to say. Beate was about to publish her autobiography and wondered if I might be interested in hearing some of her story. It turned into one of the most memorable accounts of the role an individual can play in history that I'd ever heard. When the war broke out, she'd been in the States, finishing her schooling in California. As one of only 60 Caucasians in the country who spoke Japanese, she was assigned to translate Japanese broadcasts for the War Department. It wasn't until the American occupation that she'd come back, as an American political officer, to help her second home back to its feet. With almost her first step, Beate Gordon walked right into history.
It was just a fluke. I was at the right place at the right time, and I did know Japanese. I was 22 years old. I had lived in Japan from the age of 5 to 15. I had a lot of knowledge about Japanese family relationships because my parents tried to integrate me into Japanese society. Otherwise, I really had no qualifications. Well, one day, General Whitney came into our office at 10 o'clock in the morning. There were 25 of us sitting there, and he said, "You are now a constituent assembly, and by order of General MacArthur, you will write the new Japanese constitution." General MacArthur is not satisfied with the drafts which have been brought to him by the Japanese government, and he wants a democratic constitution written, and it must be written in 1 week.
Good heavens. What thoughts went through your mind?
We didn't have time to think about anything except how to get this done. When we got out of that room where the general had made this pronouncement, Colonel Cadiz, who was his deputy, immediately divided us into groups. And he told us, the three of us, 2 men and 1 woman, that we should write the civil rights chapter of the Constitution. We sat down, and the 2 men looked at me, and they said, "Well, you're a woman, so why don't you write the women's rights?" I thought, my God, what am I going to do? I'm not a lawyer. What do I know about constitutions? I'd read the U.S. Constitution in history class, but that was about it. So I quickly got a Jeep and a Japanese driver, and I said, "Take me to any libraries that are still standing in Tokyo." Tokyo was devastated at that time. So I would borrow constitutions from whatever countries I could get. I had about 10 or 12 by the time I came back to the office. Became very popular because everybody wanted to borrow my constitutions, because most of the people working on it really were not lawyers.
Knowing the Japanese as you do,
Yes.
What were the things that you wanted to have done that you thought might be the hardest for them to accept?
Well, I saw the women walking behind their husbands on the street. I saw the woman in the house preparing the food, serving the food to her husband and his guests, and never participating. The woman had no rights. I saw that. And I wanted incorporated right into the Constitution such things as inheritance rights, property rights, rights to domicile, rights to get help from the government when a woman is pregnant. I wanted illegitimate children to have equal rights in inheritance. I really wanted to make it as broad as possible, because I had no faith in the people who would interpret the Constitution. I thought they will never, never interpret the Constitution in a liberal way.
Well, the American way won out, and Beate's provision for women and children were written out. Even today, 50 years later, it's a law she still feels.
And I remember I was so upset that I actually wept in front of everyone, which was very embarrassing, but I felt very strongly about it. But when we had a secret session with the Japanese government officials, the Japanese government officials were dead set against the women's rights. But that's when something very interesting happened.
A secret meeting to present the draft of the Constitution to the Japanese began at 10 a.m. By 2 a.m. the following morning, after a fierce debate on the post-war status of the emperor, they all finally got to the provisions on women's rights. Despite their exhaustion, after 16 straight hours, the Japanese were as upset about giving women rights as they were about withdrawing the emperor's power. Beate had been there from the start, working incognito as an interpreter, feeling her heart sink as the objections rose from the floor.
To my great surprise, Colonel Cadiz, who was the head of the steering committee, a very astute man, psychologically attuned to people, had seen that the Japanese side was very favorably inclined towards me because I wasn't there at that particular session as a drafter of the Constitution. They didn't know that. I was there as an interpreter. And during that whole period from 10 till 2 a.m., I had helped both sides. I was interpreting for the Americans and also for the Japanese. So Colonel Cadiz, having this in mind, after the first assault by the Japanese on the women's rights, said, quote, my name at that time was Sirota. Miss Sirota has her heart set on the women's rights. Why don't we pass them? I think the Japanese were just simply stunned. First of all, by knowing that I had something to do with it. And secondly, that Colonel Cadiz would say such a thing in such a serious discussion. And they just passed it. They just passed the rights.
Today, Beate feels that Japan is still short of the social rights she wanted to include. But as she herself says, 50 years is a short time for a nation, and what progress Japanese women have made has been based on the equality that new constitution promised them. The Japanese, famous for their formality, call her by her first name, Beate-san, Ms. Beate, with affection and respect. Recently, she shared a platform with a distinguished female Japanese attorney.
I said, Miss Doi, I feel embarrassed to be talking on the same platform with you because you are a constitutional lawyer and I was an amateur. And she said, that's what was so good about it. As an amateur, you wrote a humanistic draft from the heart.
If history is like a pyramid with a powerful few at the top and the huddled masses far below, then rare individuals like Beate, it seems to me, with a clear mind, good timing, and a committed heart, serve a very special role, opening every once in a while like windows to let some light shine in. Coming up, a spiritual journey back home with a most unlikely guide.
Oh, sola mia, Sam soli me India.
We travel 1,200 miles of American backroads with photographer Joel Meyerowitz and his dad. Next, on this special edition of The World.
The World is brought to you by PRI with the support of Merck, a research-driven pharmaceutical company discovering, developing, manufacturing, and marketing a broad range of human and animal health products and services. Merck, committed to bringing out the best in medicine. And by the Medtronic Foundation. When life depends on medical technology, Medtronic provides millions of patients and their physicians with therapies designed to restore health, extend life, and alleviate pain.
Hello, this is Tony Kahn with a special edition of The World. The traveler, it said, makes his biggest discovery when he comes home. So for our final side trip in this collection of Tony Kahn journals, I invite you to join me for a journey down 1,200 miles of back roads and blue highways into the heart of the American spirit with photographer Joel Meyerowitz, Joel's grown son Sasha, and a most unusual guide.
Oh, sola mia, Sam soli me India. I took you when you were just a bunch of spardia. my little baby boy.
It's his 87-year-old father, Hi, and the 1,200-mile trip he took with Joel and Joel's grown son, Sasha, along the very back roads of America from Florida to New York.
He was out of condition, living in assisted living in Florida with Alzheimer's. He was in a shrunken universe. And I thought, the road offers the unexpected and the unknown. There's an adventure inherent in the road. But I also saw it as this little capsule that my son and my father and myself could be in which we could have that intimate time to talk about things, the way people do in cars, to see America as we went north and see ourselves inhabiting it at this time.
Grandpa.
Yes, sir.
You ever been to Disney World?
Yeah, I heard of it.
Would you like to go?
Well, I'll tell you, yes and no.
It's in America, miles away from tourist traps, roadside retailers, and packaged experiences. There are no brand names here, no billboards, no churches, no chain stores, definitely no exits to the road to riches, just anonymous motels, empty fields, giant plastered dinosaurs advertising stores a third their size, and stands of naked tent poles after the flea market's gone.
My father was a salesman who did not sell. He didn't go into a store trying to sell you a product. He went in, he spent a few minutes, he had a few laughs, things were good, he left. I once asked him when I was a kid, Pop, you forgot to take the guy's order. And he looked down at me and he said, they know why I'm here. I don't have to ask them for anything. I'll go and we have a good time. And just as he said that, this guy comes running out and says, hey, hi, me, you forgot something. The guy had the order. My father gave me that wink, that knowing wink from father to son, like, didn't I tell you?
Whatever else he may have lost, Hi still has the human touch. In this land of the lost and the forgotten, at pit stops, soup kitchens, and shelters for the mentally ill, Hi is as fearless as a frontiersman, armed with a handshake and a sense of humor. He talks with people.
What do you think, I'm blind?
He poses for pictures.
Hurry up, I'm running out of time.
The connections he makes here are pretty soulful.
What's that?
Can I have a hug before you leave?
Sure.
The kind people tend to have when there's nothing to sell and nothing left to lose.
Take care, take care.
A lot of people here, sir, they haven't seen their families. Their families don't take 5 minutes to come and visit them. We've had deaths here and things like that, and the families don't show up even for that.
Yeah.
So we're their family, and you know we love them, and you have to work your mind and your heart together in order to take care of them.
Yeah.
Because you know when people feel that there's some love in the
right.
air,
The whole thing is the love. The whole thing is the love.
situation.
He wanted to go to art school. He wanted to go to medical school. He really had ambitions. And his brothers, who took over when the parents were dead, they booted him out and said, you go get a job, you do this and that. And so I think he felt all the time that he didn't get all of the opportunities that he would have liked to have, but he's going to make sure he can provide it for his kids. But in spite of all of that pressure, he never regretted anything. He always seemed to say, well, this is what the hand I was dealt, and life is good.
But for Hi, Alzheimer's ultimately is a road to nowhere, and even his awareness of his own family, the one thing he probably worked hardest for in his life, is fading fast.
You've got 3 sons.
Yes.
What are their names?
Ricky. Show him. I don't remember the name anymore.
Do you remember what it is I do?
I don't know.
Does it bother you that you can't remember your kids' names sometimes and you can't remember what they do?
Well, I tell you, yeah. I see them. Hello. Goodbye.
20 years we lived there, Pop. That's 1171 Morrison Avenue.
The end of the journey is the Meyerowitz family's old neighborhood in New York City, where High raised his children and was a man of consequence, the de facto mayor of the block.
The toughest guy in the neighborhood.
He can't remember it. The tenements of the first-generation American Jews like High have been replaced here, just as fleetingly, you feel, by the crumbling projects for Latinos and blacks.
So you still live in this country?
Do I live here?
In a sense, the entire territory of this film, from the towers of Manhattan to the 1,200 featureless flat miles they crossed, has been a foreign country. Foreign, too, in a quality we don't think of as particularly American these days, simple human decency. Toward the end of the film, High turns to Joel with a secret he never revealed, the meaning to him of Charlie Chaplin's Little Tramp, the ultimate nobody on the road to nowhere, a character that High used to imitate to charm his children and his friends.
He was a giant, and in the height of a little midget. He was this little guy, righting all the wrongs, helping others. There's a beautiful deed for the day. That was what I loved. The goodness, the goodness.
Did you feel connected to him in that way?
Always, always, always. When anybody would show a little bit something to me that I was accepted or allowed, and they would talk to me, and they'd pat me on the top of the head or would put their hands around me. I'm home. I loved everybody. I loved everybody, but nobody saw me. Nobody remembered me. Nobody knew me. Nobody saw me. But I was there.
Well, your boys saw you. We all saw you.
It's an amazing self-image for a man to have after so much of his life has faded away, and an incredible picture for an old salesman like High to be selling at the end of his days. An image of an America great not for its winners, but its so-called losers, and of a people rich in the wisdom that it's not what you're left holding on to that matters, but whom you touched along the way.
I loved when you were the strong man in the neighborhood. You could take a guy who was a doctor or a principal of a school or a businessman, and you can take another guy who was just an ordinary worker, and you would treat them the same, and you would bring them all to the same level, and that would be the level of laughter.
You saw me. You saw Papa.
That's right.
This special edition of The World was produced with the assistance of Stephen Snyder. Our engineer was Mike Wilkins. Our executive producer is Bob Ferrante. For The World, I'm Tony Kahn.
The World is a co-production of the BBC World Service, Public Radio International, and WGBH Boston, and is made possible in part by the PRI Program Fund, whose contributors include the Ford Foundation, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Fund, helping people to make the arts a part of their everyday lives.
PRI, Public Radio International.